We turn to this now. Judicial Tribunal has cleared Eastern Cape Judge President Selby Mbenenge of gross misconduct in the sexual harassment case brought against him by his former secretary Andiswa Mengo. However, he was found guilty of a degree of wrongdoing. The tribunal says he contravened Article 5.1 of the Code of Judicial Conduct by engaging in a flirtatious relationship with Mengo at the workplace during office hours. Mengo filed the charges against him in January 2023. Well, Judges Matters Mbekezeli Benjamin joins us now for reaction and analysis. Mbekezeli, good to have you, and thank you very much for coming on this afternoon. Well, that finding, quite interesting in how it's worded, a degree of misconduct referring to Section 5.1 of the Code of Judicial Conduct. What is the implication of that finding, and what does it really mean as far as that Code of Conduct is concerned?
Yeah, good afternoon, Mr. Mdluli, and good afternoon to the viewers of Newzroom Afrika. Well, the JSC Act makes provision for three forms of judicial misconduct. One is a lesser form of misconduct, which may be just dismissed summarily. Usually that would relate to if you're disgruntled with a judgment and you just file a complaint against the judge. So those are lesser forms of misconduct. The second category of misconduct is what is considered serious but non-impeachable misconduct. So that conduct is usually when a judge has done something wrong, they haven't delivered a judgment on time, they failed to observe all of the court processes, the trial rules, so they didn't give a fair trial, they didn't act honorably, depending on the degree. And so that is the second level of misconduct. And then the highest form of misconduct is what is called gross misconduct. And gross misconduct is the one that gets a judge impeached. Yeah. And so what the tribunal found in this case is that when you look at the totality of the evidence in the Mbenenge tribunal, you couldn't find that he committed an act of sexual harassment, and so you can't find him guilty of gross misconduct. But he initiated a relationship with a member of staff. It started off in the workplace during working hours and later branched off to WhatsApp. Yeah. And so that is a failure to observe what is called Article 5, which is a duty on a judge to act honorably, both in their official responsibility as a judge, but also in their private lives. And so the tribunal concluded that if you look at all of the evidence, yes, it's not sexual harassment, but it can't just be nothing. It is something, and it is a failure to act honorably on the part of Judge Mbenenge.
And does it carry any implications in terms of, one, those who feel aggrieved in this particular instance, reviewing that finding, but two, does the finding itself have any sanctions attached to it as far as the judge saying, well, on Monday I'm ready to go back to work?
So the process is not yet complete, Thabo. It still needs to go to the Judicial Service Commission. And here it's the Judicial Service Commission sitting without the members of Parliament. So it will be the 13 judges and lawyers on the JSC who will determine whether this finding is factually and legally sound, but more importantly, they will determine the sanction. So what kind of punishment will Judge Mbenenge get for not acting honorably? And in the past, we've seen fines being issued. Judge Mutata initially was given a fine of R1 million. The judge can be suspended. The judge can be forced to give an apology or written warning. There are a number of sanctions that are available to the JSC, but only if the JSC accepts the finding, because the JSC does have the power to actually disregard the findings by the tribunal. Right. So they can't disregard the factual findings. Yes. So, for example, the finding that Ms. Mengo lied, the JSC can't disregard that, but they can say, look, when you read the facts and you read the law, the legal conclusion cannot be just ordinary misconduct. It may be gross misconduct. So there is still an opportunity, and which is why it's quite surprising to hear that Judge Mbenenge intends to go to work on Monday, because the process is still underway. And the most important thing, I think, at the end of 2024, the reason why the Judicial Service Commission didn't place him on suspension or didn't advise the president to suspend him was because he had asked for special leave. Yeah. And so you can't then, in the middle of the process, saying that, oh, the special leave is over, I'm going back to work on Monday. Now,
does then the process as it continues allow for the complainant to further make the case and make further submissions onto the matter?
Yes, ordinarily after a tribunal report, the JSC gives both the complainant and the respondent judge an opportunity to make submissions. They make submissions to say either the findings by the tribunal were wrong or they misread the evidence, and so they would either argue for the JSC to impose a greater finding. We saw this happen in the Makubele Tribunal, where the tribunal report had said that she's guilty of gross misconduct on one ground, but it's a lesser form of misconduct on a second ground. The JSC said, no. After hearing the submissions, of course, from both parties, the JSC said, no, both grounds constitute gross misconduct, and that's why Judge Makubele is undergoing impeachment at the moment.
Yeah, and of course, the other question would be for you, I mean, if you look at the process and how it's been handled, I think it's 169 pages of this particular report that you're going through. And when you read them, you can see that the tribunal is trying by all means to say, no, we are not making this decision because she's a woman. You know, we are making this decision because, one, we're weighing the WhatsApp messages. You know, at some point, there was an exchange here. You were responding, and he was saying you were responding, or you tried to hide your response, which were also flirtatious, and that type of thing. So this is not based on the fact that you're a woman that we are penalizing you, but we're just looking at the facts. Does this, I suppose, give us a representation of how difficult a sexual harassment case really can be made, especially in the workplace?
Look, Thabo, you can't ignore the context that this is the first case to reach this far, a case of sexual harassment to reach this far, to reach a tribunal. And so the decisions that were taken in this tribunal will set some sort of precedent. And I think the tribunal was very worried about this perception that they are ruling or they're making decisions based on the fact that the complainant is a woman. And so they keep, in many parts of the report, you keep seeing that we're making the decision because of this and not because she's a woman. And so I think that that is a way for them to sort of pacify some of the critics of the tribunal process, who said that, for example, it seemed as if the inquiry was, instead of looking at the fitness of the judge, you're now looking at the fitness of the complainant. So that was one of the criticisms leveled against the tribunal. And so it seems to be that, well, when you read the report, it does seem that they're trying to respond to those critics.
Yeah. The one area, of course, that they immediately dismissed in the tribunal is the area of competence. So they said we are not necessarily looking at that at all. We are just purely focusing on the question of gross misconduct.
Yes. So in terms of Section 177 of the Constitution, there are only 3 grounds on which a judge may be impeached. One is incapacity. One is the second is incompetence, and then the third is gross misconduct. So the tribunal was saying, no, here this inquiry is not about these 2. It's solely focused on gross misconduct and whether the judge misconducted themselves to the degree that it actually rises to the level of impeachment. And so the focus was really on the conduct of the judge and the conduct of the complainant, of course. And they make quite really harsh findings against her, saying that she lied under oath, she omitted certain evidence that was not in her favor. So those findings, they were trying to look at the conduct element. And I think the other thing, Judge Mbenenge's legal team had fought very hard to focus the inquiry only on the sexual harassment element, because the legal definition of sexual harassment is that it was unwelcome. So there were advances of a sexual nature that were unwelcome. So they spent quite a bit of time trying to show that they were not unwelcome. She was an active participant. And they also at the same time said the tribunal shouldn't expand the inquiry to looking at more general conduct of the judge. They should only focus on the sexual harassment. Of course, the tribunal said, nope, yes, your client is not guilty of sexual harassment, but we can't limit it only to sexual harassment. We do have to look at the conduct of the judge, and that's why they arrived at that finding to say he did not act honorably in terms of Article 5 of the Code of Conduct.
So you mentioned the conduct of the complainant as well. I mean, the JSC now coming back to look at this particular report, and I think it's the first 2 conclusions that were reached by the tribunal, that the credibility of the complainant is in question. Is that something that the JSC now needs to look at in their consideration?
So ordinarily in a process of this nature, where you have a fact-finding inquiry stage and then you have a decision-making stage. So the tribunal was only a fact-finding stage. The ultimate decision is with the JSC. So there are certain factual findings and credibility findings that the tribunal had made because they were sitting with the witness in front of them and the witness was cross-examined. So some of those credibility findings will be very hard for the JSC to overturn. And so they will have to look at, based on these credibility findings, these factual findings, and when you apply the legal standards that are in place, is the conclusion that the tribunal reached, does it stand up to scrutiny? That is the question that the JSC is meant to answer in this process. Because if you recall, Thabo, there was that case of Judge Mutata and it went to the Supreme Court of Appeal. Yeah. And one of the key grounds of criticism that the Supreme Court of Appeal made against the JSC was that the tribunal said Judge Mutata had misconducted himself. They had made factual findings. The JSC then disregarded all of the factual findings. The SCA said, you can't do that. You need to, those factual findings, they stand. The conclusions based on the findings are different. Yeah. And so that is the domain of the JSC. And so that is what the homework of the JSC at the moment is, to look whether actually reaching the conclusion of not guilty of gross misconduct, is that something supported by the facts and the evidence that was laid at the tribunal?
Well, we don't know what the outcome of the JSC is going to be, but if the outcome of the JSC does indeed confirm and support the findings of the tribunal that the judge has been found to have misconducted himself, especially in this particular area. I mean, what does it mean for a judge president going forward, where he would need to sit in similar matters of this nature?
Look, it's a difficult question, Thabo, because the system that we have in South Africa is that when you are accused of wrongdoing, you need to undergo a process, and the outcome of the process, good or bad, must be respected. And so, in a sense, if the JSC in the end finds that the tribunal findings were correct, he's not guilty of gross misconduct, and there is no court challenge to those findings, then he does have, in all fairness, he does have to go back to work and continue with his duties. But I think what your question is getting at is what kind of scrutiny and what kind of standards do we hold our judicial officers? And you're quite right. We do hold them to very high standards. And so it does sort of, it's not a happy situation. It's not a happy conclusion. You never want to see the leader of a court in this kind of situation. But at the same time, we do have to respect the outcome of legal processes of this nature.
There's a lot we needed to get through here, Mbekezeli Benjamin, so we're not going to get to the other issue that we wanted to talk to you about, but I appreciate your time and thank you very much for coming through.
Thank you.
That is Mbekezeli Benjamin there for us, responding to the ruling by the Judicial Tribunal on the sexual harassment case against Judge President Mbenenge.